So I would like to start by thanking Ottmar once again for the talk last night. We had a tremendous amount of good feedback about the talk and people who were really thrilled with his talk and how he put it together. And so that's, I think, it was a perfect opening for the conference. So I hope all of you were able to be at that talk and hear what he had to say. And it was recorded, and we will be making that available at some point through the Hanley Sustainability Institute website. We'll be editing together that presentation. The way this is set up today, the whole day is set up and tomorrow is set up as a set of panel discussions, moderated panel discussions, with then plenty of time for questions from the audience too. So the way I wanted to start today, this morning, was to really ask Ottmar if he has a couple of points that he would like to expand on from last night, and maybe even in the direction of what are some of the important next steps? What are the things that will really make it possible for us to, if you want to put it this way, implement Laudato Si, or implement climate change agreements, and how can that work, and if there are some crucial steps that need to be taken. And then after that, I may ask a couple other questions, but as I said, we're going to leave plenty of time for discussion with the audience as well. So Ottmar, are there any things you would like to start out with?
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much. It was an enormous pleasure to be with you yesterday, and I would like to highlight again how valuable it is that Dayton University, a Catholic university, is really reflecting on this encyclical. And this is important because we are at risk that the encyclical remains a large media event, but in the end is widely ignored, right? And let me go back a little bit in the history of the social teaching of the Church. So the first encyclical which has addressed the time of industrialization was the encyclical Rerum Novarum at the beginning of the industrialization. And this encyclical has launched a huge social movement, not just in Europe, but also in the United States. And there have been a lot of Catholics who have been deeply concerned about the relation between employers and workers. We had struggles and fights in Europe between the Church and the Union. But in the end, the whole thing culminates in Europe after the Second World War. And probably you might be aware how influential was the social teaching of the Church in Europe after the Second World War. The reunification of Europe, Europe as an idea, as a community, as a region of solidarity and subsidiarity, this has been promoted by Catholics like Robert Schuman, Konrad Adenauer, and so on. And this was a very deep and a very profound idea. And this idea comes from the papal encyclical like Rerum Novarum Quadragesimo Anno. And this was a very, very profound foundation for a social movement after the Second World War. And I have to confess, I grew up basically in this kind of social Catholicism, which almost disappeared in Europe. And it is a big and a large tragedy. If we look at the Eastern European countries like Poland, like Hungary, one of the biggest problems is that the Catholic teaching of the Church has basically no roots in the civil society. That's now a big problem, because to be a conservative in Poland and Hungary means now, in the current situation, to be very nationalistic. But Catholics in Europe after the Second World War haven't been nationalistic. They had a European vision, a very clear European vision. And we lack this vision now. And I hope that Pope Francis provides with this encyclical a renewed idea. What does it mean in the contemporary times? What does it mean to implement solidarity, subsidiarity, a clear understanding about the dignity of the person? So this is something which I hope, and my feeling is that it is so important that Catholic universities take on and reflect on what the Pope is saying, which does not mean we have to agree with everything what is in the encyclical. I have 4 points from my point of view how we should proceed. First of all, and this is quite important, and I think this is at least a common denominator among all the Catholics around the globe. So Catholics are inherently not nationalists. We have a clear understanding that at this current stage, we have to think about the international level. We need international cooperation. And let me emphasize one important point. Many people are arguing we need a strong civil society. I agree. We need strong civil society movements. But at the same time, I would like emphasize how important it is that these 195 countries around the globe will learn to cooperate. And even if you do not believe in climate change, and even if you do not believe climate policy is important, then you should at least think about the following. Climate change might be not the most important problem. There might be other important problems, equally important problems. But climate change is a problem where humankind has to learn in the next 10 years to build up a structure of international cooperation. This is unprecedented in history. And if you look at Paris, and I have to say many, many critical things about Paris in a few minutes, but it was the largest gathering of the heads of states ever in human history. And this was a very important signal. A very important signal. What we need is international cooperation. And as Catholics, and also as non-Catholics, we should support this view that we need a kind of a solidarity because it's our own planet. And Paris is a wonderful starting point to build up on this international cooperation. Now let me become a little bit more practical. And now I become a little bit more critical about Paris. Paris was a diplomatic success, but it was by no means a breakthrough for international climate policy. Why? I mentioned this because of the fact we have only voluntary contributions on the table. We have now a very high level, so to say, of political energy, but we are at risk that the level of cooperation declines over time in the next few years when we have to figure out the nitty-gritty stuff. So how to make the voluntary contributions to almost binding reciprocal contributions among the nations. And let me highlight what is necessary. I told you that even if all the countries stick to the intended national determined contributions, this basically means the almost 80% of the available carbon budget is exhausted. At the same time, in 10 countries, they build up 90% of the capacity for coal-fired plants. We have now 10 years. Within this 10 years, if all these coal-fired plants will build up, we can forget about the 1.5 degree target, and we can forget about the 2 degree target. The next 10 years are absolutely crucial. And therefore, it is my plea that in international climate policy, we have to find effective entry points. And I would like to remind you, the emissions are on a growing pathway. It might be the case in the last year we had a growth rate of 0, but I do not believe that this is a sustained pattern. I believe that in the next few years we will see again rising emissions. So what can we do? First of all, I think we need in the crucial countries, like in Europe, like in the United States, like in China, India, Indonesia, South Africa, Vietnam, Thailand, we need as a short-term entry point carbon pricing. It sounds like a typical economics recipe. Economists are happy if they can price something. And as you know, what Oscar Wilde said, an economist is somebody who knows the price, who knows the costs of everything but the value of nothing. But I would say this is not true. So what we have to do is, in economics, we have to make sure that our price system reflects the real world scarcities. And what is the most important scarcity factor in the 21st century? It's the limiting disposal space of the atmosphere. Here I would like to share with you an anecdote. I gave the same talk basically last year at the Royal Society in Scotland, and there was a very outspoken climate skeptic there. It was Lord Monckton. And he stand up and say, why can you, Professor, recommend such a tremendous thing like a carbon price imposing on our economies based on such uncertain scientific insights? Why are you so dare to impose something which is a threat for our freedom and for our prosperity? And my response was the following. I said to him, look, the main difference is I am coming from continental Europe, you are living on an island. And in continental Europe, we had a strong experience with the Eastern economies, the breakdown of the Eastern economies. Why did the Eastern economies break down? The reason was these economies are not willing to accept fundamental scarcities. They have subsidized capital, they have subsidized labor, and in the end they realized they had a declining level of investments and they had declining wage rates. This leads to the breakdown of the Eastern economies. They have been highly inefficient. If we do not respect, as our societies, our capitalist societies, if we do not respect and take into account the limiting disposal space of the atmosphere, we are equally doomed to fail. Because in the end we will have large climate impacts, and therefore I argue, if we want to secure freedom and prosperity for our societies, carbon pricing is not a sufficient but an absolutely necessary step. It's nothing to impose on an economy, to torture economy, to reduce productivity. It's the contrary. If we have a carbon price, we will increase productivity. We should use the revenues of the carbon pricing for the useful things. Now, how can this happen at an international scale? It is quite clear that the United States and Europe have a different carbon price compared to India or to Vietnam. But what we can do is, and we have this institution which is called the Green Climate Fund, which provides transfers as an order of magnitude by 100 billion per year. What we should do is we should design these transfers from the Green Climate Fund in a conditional way. We should say to Vietnam, okay, if you accept a higher carbon price, let's say from $3 per ton CO2 to 10 or even to $20 per ton CO2, then you will get a transfer from the Green Climate Fund which allows you to bear crucial costs, additional incremental costs you have for your economy. So this could be a starting point where we can see that step by step we might see an increasing level of carbon pricing and even a convergence of the carbon prices. It seems to me the combination of carbon pricing and conditional transfers from the Green Climate Fund is the most important institutional innovation we need in the next few years. So that's step one. Step two, at the national level. At the national level, we should help countries like Mexico, like Vietnam, to design carbon pricing schemes and in particular energy subsidy reforms, which basically means to reduce the subsidies for the fossil fuels in a way which does not hurt the low-income households. And it seems to me there are many proposals around which can be used for this, and in addition to that, I would like to highlight that many developing countries will face a fundamental infrastructure gap, and carbon pricing is by far the best way to raise money compared to capital taxes, labor taxes, and income taxes. It's a very simple rule. It's better taxing bads than taxing goods. At a national scale, this carbon tax and carbon price reform seems to me absolutely crucial. Step three, what I would like to highlight. We should make sure, and this is something which is absolutely crucial, to convince the institutional investors around the globe that carbon pricing is important. And this can be combined in a very nice way with the ongoing divestment movement. The divestment movement is probably one of the most important movements in the civil society. But the divestment movement will achieve nothing, almost nothing, if it is not complemented by a carbon price. Why? Let's assume that you have a few institutional investors, they divest. This basically means the prices for the stocks will decline, and this is a strong incentive for others to buy these stocks. And this is exactly what happened now in Europe when, for example, the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Norway has sold the stocks from the fossil fuels. The divestment movement, nevertheless, is crucially and is very important because institutional investors are extremely powerful agents on planet Earth. At the first week of the Paris meeting, we organized a conference with the governor of the French central bank and with the financial industry. And it was really encouraging to learn that the whole financial industry is willing to accept a carbon price. But, and this is also quite important, they said they will not fight for a carbon price. They will accept it, but not fight for a carbon price. Who then should fight for a carbon price? Exactly the people who want to divest and find a way. The people who are involved in this divestment movement combine divestment with carbon pricing. And my last point, which I would like to highlight, and this is equally important for Europe and also for the United States. It seems to me we have established a model, an economic model, where the division of labor between market, state, and civil society is inherently unbalanced. We gave in the past markets too much weight and too much power. The level of inequality has been increased significantly, not just in the United States, but also in Europe, almost equally. The level of bequests has been increased. And it is also interesting to see that the land rents in the United States, but also in Europe, has been increased significantly and has reduced almost the wages of many workers in large parts of the OECD countries. So from my point of view, if we want to get rid of these problems, we have to find a way of smart governance and of smart governments. And this is something which is enormously important. We accepted already in the last few years when people told us it is the right way to reduce the intervention from the government and to increase the importance and the size of the markets and in particular of the financial sector. And this is something which has to be rebalanced, also in Europe, but also in the United States. I have no idea how you in the United States can communicate this properly, but at least this is something which from my point of view is necessary. We need a kind of a new model which brings us in a new balance between market, state, and the civil society. So these are my 4 points and my 4 reflections about how to address this issue and what could we do and what could be the next practical steps.
Okay, thank you, Ottmar. I don't know where to start. There's a lot of questions I could ask and a couple things that occurred to me, but I'm going to go back to maybe the big question of the global commons and the atmospheres of global commons. So you're a big fan of Elinor Ostrom and how we deal with problems of the commons. And the way I understand Ostrom and others is that a successful governing of the commons has to do often with local solutions and with agreement between groups who are involved in a local commons. Here we're talking about a global commons, and so is there some sort of an inherent tension almost between how we can think of past models of local governance of the commons and this very large global commons, and whether that causes additional problems?
I think it causes a lot of additional problems because this was my first statement. So to translate what we learned from Elinor Ostrom governing the local commons cannot be applied immediately to the global commons. And this is indeed an additional level of complexity. And I had a hard time after the conference, of the failure of the conference in Copenhagen, but because between 2009 and Paris, everybody was so tired about international conferences. And I agree with all of them, because I attend many of these conferences, and this is really almost a torture to be part of these conferences. No doubt about this. But there is no way how to avoid a real international treaty. This is what I said from the very beginning on. International cooperation is necessary, it's unavoidable. If I would find a way, either at a local level, divestment movement, technological change, if one of this would work, I would say, let's get rid of these international conferences. But I am deeply convinced that we need these international conferences. And one reason I would like to highlight. So I'm coming from an institute where I'm surrounded with physicists like Bob. And physicists and economists, so they are in an endless ongoing struggle. So this is one of the nicest thing in my life, to struggle and to fight with my colleagues from the physics department. Now, what most physicists believe is the following. They say, come on, these international conferences are not important. Let's rely on technological change. So let's assume the following. Tomorrow, we will wake up and we will see that the renewables are so cheap that nobody has any incentive to extract coal, oil, and gas from the ground, right? So basically, due to this wonderful miracle, there is no need to have an international cooperation, to have an international treaty, because technological change has solved the problem for us. This is a wonderful vision, right? I trust engineers much more than diplomats. And to have the fate of the planet in the hands of the diplomats is not really a very assuring assumption. But nevertheless, think a little bit about it, what I said. Is this really realistic? It could be the case that in a few decades from now, technological change is such profound and such disruptive that this could happen. But I told you we have now 10 years. Do we really believe that in the next 10 years, nobody has any incentive to extract coal and oil from the ground? Let's assume that we will be very successful in deploying renewables. The renewables become cheaper and cheaper. But at the same time, there is less demand for fossil fuels, and the price of fossil fuels will also decline. So you create an incentive for the poor countries, nevertheless, to deploy coal, oil, and gas. And this is due to the fact that we have so much oil and gas and coal underground. It's the supply. And many people believed over the last 20 years, it's the scarcity of the fossil fuels which will solve the problem for us. But this is not the case. It's not the fossil fuels are not scarce. We are not running out of the fossil fuels. There is no peak oil, which basically means compared to the limiting disposal space of the atmosphere, so we have too much fossil fuels underground. So we have to deal with this problem. So the carbon pricing and the international cooperation is a kind of a hedging strategy if technological change is less successful than we thought. I'm absolutely not against technological change. I believe in technological change. It's necessary. But nevertheless, so we have to deal with this enormous supply of the fossil fuels. And therefore, international cooperation and carbon pricing is so essential. Why is carbon pricing so essential? So carbon pricing is doing three wonderful things. It incentivizes carbon-free technologies, but at the same time it penalizes the use of fossil fuels, which makes fossil fuels more expensive. And this is the real reason why people have then no longer an incentive to extract oil and gas from the ground. And this is the real challenge. And what you can see here is that this will become, for many, many countries who rely very much on coal, a big, big issue. And the only way how these countries could become convinced that a phase out of coal is even beneficial for them could be indeed a reasonable carbon pricing strategy. And this will become a very tough thing if we have to talk about Germany, my own country, we have to talk about coal, and we have to talk about Australia. All these countries rely very heavily on coal. And despite of the undisputed technological progress in renewable sector, no doubt about this, I would like to remind you, we are living in an age of the renaissance of the fossil fuels. And the low oil price, the current low oil price, has only partially something to do with speculation. the most important reason why we have now a low oil price was the reason we had a high oil price, a very high oil price, which incentivizes a lot of money in exploring new oil fields. So basically the high oil price in the past has increased the supply of oil, and now we have much more supply, and we have an almost stable demand. But so this is something which is at the same time a problem. A high oil price incentivizes the investments in the exploration. A low oil price increases the demand for SUVs and so on. So, and with this low oil price, now the current oil price, this is a wonderful opportunity to start a dialogue and a discourse about carbon pricing. Because now you have room, economic room, maneuver space to impose such a carbon price.
Let's see. So if I want to ask maybe one more, and then I'll start going towards the audience. And I have to say, as a physicist who showed up at PIC, noticing that there were a lot of physicists around, and also my first experience at PIC was talking about peak oil. This was
oh yeah,
when I went.
I never forgot.
I know this is our first big argument at lunch was about peak oil. I also published a paper many years ago about why even peak oil wouldn't solve the climate problem, even at 2 times CO2. So it's been clear for a long time that even in that case. And I have to say, I've also, as a physicist who has learned a lot of economics from Ottmar and his colleagues, have come to appreciate over the years much more exactly these economic points, and if I want to put it this way, the desperation to which humanity will go to extract things from the ground and burn them if there aren't any counter incentives. So this has been very instructional to me. But so let me go to the economics models. You're at PIC. There are models of climate change mitigation. These are complicated models of the economy, of the energy system, and then of climate. And the basic starting point, I have to say, is if we hear different things about economic models, but at PIC, I would say the models are, we assume the science is right, we assume that there are targets we need to meet. Now the model has the duty to say what's the best way to get to that goal that we've set. So I think that has to be made clear. But these models are still very optimistic in the sense that they assume that markets function, they assume that we're acting rationally, they assume a lot of things in there that says, well, they don't take into account interference in the political system by vested interest. So how much faith do you really have in those models that say that we could do a 2-degree target, we could reach that at very low cost to the economy over time? And for example, when you say we build up more coal-fired power plants so we can't reach 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees C, we could, in the sense that there could be stranded assets, that something that doesn't often maybe show up in these rational models, but rather says, okay, we're just going to have to build those coal-fired power plants, and at some point we decide those are just useless assets that are big losses to industry, to society, to the economy in general. Do you have any comments about how these models play into thinking about our options?
Now, from my point of view, let's assume that we would have a model which assumes all these nice things you mentioned, like the markets are well functioning and so on, and we could come up with such kind of models and say, oh, sorry, to achieve a 2-degree target is very high. It's almost impossible. If such a model, and quite optimistic model, would tell you such a thing, you would say, okay, now we have a deep problem. You wouldn't argue, oh, we have a political problem and we have to get rid of the institutional issues. So what I'm saying is it's a best case, a quite optimistic benchmark. What we can, if we are successful, can be achieved so far. But this model has to be complemented by a few other things which I would like to highlight. You mentioned stranded assets, and you are absolutely right. You say, why should we be concerned when now people are building coal-fired plants? If after 2030 we decide we want to have a very ambitious climate policy, these are stranded assets, fine. So then the owners of the utility has to live with that. But this is exactly from a political economy point of view my concern. When countries are now building the highly efficient coal-fired plants, for example in India, also in Vietnam, and after 2007 we say, guys, you have only voluntary contributions until 2030, now we expect from you a little bit more. What will then a country like Vietnam tell us? They say, we cannot reduce the emissions because we have so much stranded assets. And this is exactly the political economy point of view. I'm really concerned about the potential stranded assets we are producing now when we want to impose a very, very ambitious climate policy after 2030. So this is a political economy argument. And the second thing is what I would like to highlight. We have the same problem in Europe with our emissions trading scheme. Markets are, and you're absolutely right, markets are not well functioning. So we have designed a European emissions trading scheme which is inherently not consistent with the investment decisions the utility owners are undertaking now. And this is something which is absolutely crucial. And what is our task? From my point of view, the most important task is to design an environmental and the climate policy which in the end really works. What we have seen so far, it hasn't worked. Admittedly, at the European scale, the European emissions trading scheme at least delivered the cap until 2030. That's fine. But we are in the same problem. I heard a highly ranked official from the EU Commission says, okay, now we had such a big success in Paris, so this success guarantees we can continue building up coal-fired plants in Poland, right? So this is for them the conclusion, and this is an absolutely inappropriate conclusion. We have to talk to our colleagues in Poland, but in the end, we need a kind of a transition phase. And the transition phase, again, has to be complemented, and I'm saying this, the same thing again, by reasonable carbon pricing. Otherwise, we are at risk to create stranded assets after 2030. And this is something where I deeply believe countries will not allow. And therefore, what we have to do now is that in our policies, we do not create too much lock-ins. And to be honest, my impression is the following. In Paris, we had all the environmental ministers, and the environmental ministers at this time had absolutely their intention to make reasonable contributions. But the economic ministers at home, they are responsible for the planning of the coal-fired plants, and they said when the environmental ministers come home from Paris, we'll tell them what real politics should look like. Right? That's my clear impression.
Yeah. So I've got a couple of bookkeeping things. One, Yusuf, our social media person, has asked me to let you know that if you're tweeting or otherwise using social media, then the hashtag for the conference in general is UD Laudato Si. All right, for those of you who do that. I also want to, Rebecca, you had your hand up, so I'll call on you as for a question, but then I also want to invite some of the other participants, the speakers, since one of the reasons for this conference is that there's some of the other speakers who have made contributions can ask fellow speakers questions to clarify points as they're writing their contributions for the book. I'd like to make sure that there's a chance for that, especially in this case, since Ottmar has to leave right after this session to go to the airport. So I'll start with Rebecca as a question, and then other speakers, if you have any questions, then I'll come to you as well. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Edenhofer. Last night and today it's just been very enlightening for me. And I raised my hand quickly because you triggered an idea in my head that I've been wrestling with when you mentioned the commons. And Eleanor Ostrom deals with commonly pooled resources that are extracted. She talks a lot about fish, for example. There's some differences between the models that she uses to show ways of governance of a commonly pooled resource
That's a very interesting question. Now let me clarify the following point. Definitely, you are right. We cannot police the atmosphere. However, so think about the following: who has now the property rights on the atmosphere? Almost everybody, right? It's a kind of a free land. And if we say we want to limit the carbon budget, the global carbon budget around the 1,000 gigatons CO2, this basically means we have to allocate new property rights to the people who have the fossil fuels underground, right? So basically what we, in one way or another, are saying is, so this is the limiting carbon budget, and we allocate the carbon budget to people, and this defines, so to say, the user rights. It's exactly what Elinor Ostrom is doing. The problem is, if we allocate the user rights to the owners of coal, oil, and gas, this immediately means we devalue the assets underground, right? So and dramatically. But there's only good news. This is the bad news. There are good news. The good news is we know the money we can make from taxation or from auctioning this property rights, these revenues are much larger. They overcompensate the devalue of the assets underground. That are the good news. This I forgot yesterday, because this is the really optimistic thing. So we lose a little bit the devaluation of the assets, but at the same time, the revenues overcompensates by far. So we create a kind of a new type of income, and in the strange language of economists, you could call this a climate rent. And the crucial question is, how should we deal with this climate rent? Who owns the climate rent? How to distribute the climate rents? Now this is something which is quite important, and therefore my feeling is it's exactly at a global scale what Elinor Ostrom had in mind. It's the extraction part, it's the assignment of property rights, it is the value of the new property rights, and it's a creation of a new rent, and the question is, how should this rent be used for other purposes?
And this is, go ahead, Rebecca, do you have a quick follow-up? Yeah.
Just a quick follow-up. So, but the missing piece in that is that, say, if you take fish, there will be a process of renewal, and if we have a fixed limit, I mean, which you do, the 1,000 gigatons of carbon
Yeah.
that can, dioxide that can go into the atmosphere, wouldn't that put a different psychological pressure on the community?
Yes, I agree, but the renewal part in my story is then indeed technological change. Because in the end, if we can rely on a kind of a carbon-free technology like the renewables, so if we have a limited carbon budget and nothing else, this would be very, very depressing. Very, very depressing. But what I'm not saying we have no technological options. What I am saying is these technological options can only work if we at the same time assign the property rights on the things underground explicitly or implicitly in a new way. So, and this makes, so to say, the prospect of technological change, the renewables, this makes the whole thing a little bit more optimistic. But the crucial thing is, and this is something which we have a new steady state in our economy, but the crucial thing is the transition phase. And the problem is, we have not too much time for this transition phase. And this is really a climate problem, is to a large extent a timing problem. And this is something which we have to learn.
And so if any of you have interest in some of that, I've actually been involved in a couple of papers published with colleagues at PIC on some of these climate rent kinds of ideas, so we can talk about those. MT, can I go to you? And then, there's 4 speakers back there, yes?
And I think it follows well from this previous question. So I'm hearing the scientific and the economic pieces, and I want to hear you speak about national security pieces and where militarization might have come in, whether in the Paris talks or in other conversations. Because as I'm hearing these points that you're making, that's sort of in the back of my mind, is that we have militarized a lot of our energy
Yeah, so this has two components, and I'm afraid that I will say something which is politically highly incorrect, but nevertheless, I will do. The first part on the mitigation part, that's an interesting point. So I described the whole thing from a very global perspective. Now, let's become a little bit more practical in the sense we have to understand, and you are absolutely right, that this is also a kind of a competition, a kind of a struggle between resource exporting countries and resource importing countries. And this has a lot to do with oil. It's not just a coal problem, it's primarily also an oil problem. Now, whenever I talk and say we devalue the assets, we have to price the carbon, people come up and say, what about Saudi Arabia? Will Saudi Arabia ever accept the carbon tax? Will Saudi Arabia ever accept that we impose something on them? And my answer is no. They will never accept this. But there is absolutely no need they accept this. Because if we, the OECD countries, impose a carbon price, a carbon tax, not just on oil, but also on gas and oil, so then this means we tax the imports, the oil imports from the Middle East, which basically means we tax away the Saudi Arabian and the Russian rents. And this is exactly what we should do now. We should now impose a tax on our oil imports. This would help our economy not to destroy the substitution successes we had over the last few decades, but this would also allow us to capture some of these resource rents. So this is my first answer. It's a little bit nasty one, because if my friends from Saudi Arabia will hear this, they will say, this is a very nasty guy, because he proposing something which is damaging our economy. In the end, it will not damage the economies, because Saudi Arabia has to find a way to get a little bit more independent from oil, and the same is true for Russia. We will do a service to Russia if we help them to find a way to diversify their economies. So the whole thing has another part, a national security part, and this has a lot to do with migration. Yesterday I showed you the relationship between Africa, in particular the northern part of Africa, and Europe. And we Europeans, we have to learn now, we are in the middle of a very deep and profound social learning process, that we can no longer expect that we have a declining economy in Africa and a very wealthy economy in Europe, and we believe that there is no migration flows. And this has a lot to do. I gave a talk 10 years ago about this issue in front of high-ranked militaries. And when I show them the map I have showed you yesterday, it was not exactly the same map, but it was roughly an indication. They saw the map and say, look, what you are showing me is something which we as a military as a military body, we cannot deal with this. You have to find other ways to deal with this migration crisis. These guys are absolutely right. We have to find a way. And this is something which is in the middle of our security issues across Europe. And this is something which is very profound and has the potential to destroy the European Union. But there's just a risk. At the same time, I hope that in Europe we can mobilize the moral energies to deal with that issue. But now in Europe, if you talk about climate change, 5 years ago, many Europeans said, okay, this is this strange thing environmentalists talk about. But now people become, because of the migration crisis, very much aware that the relationship between Africa and Europe needs also to be rebalanced exactly in this way. And these are, from my point of view, the two important parts of national security issues.
It's clearly one of the reasons why the U.S. military in their quadrennial defense review, et cetera, think of climate change as being one of their biggest threats, or a threat multiplier in the future. Aaron, you had your hand up, and then...
I was wondering, as a veteran of negotiations, how do you see the negotiations with the current owners of fossil fuel resources that are underground in such a way that they can be persuaded to leave them stranded? And what percentage of the revenues from a carbon price is owed to them in justice or is owed to them in some other fashion? How do we negotiate that?
That's a very interesting question. First of all, I would say the owners of the fossil fuel in the Paris meeting, it was quite clear. They did everything. So for them, the whole agreement was only acceptable because we are talking just about voluntary contributions. So they will never accept this. Saudi Arabia is a very special case in the negotiations. So in the end, when we talk about carbon price, I think we have to find international fora. Without Saudi Arabia, they will never accept such a thing. I negotiated the whole text about subsidies and carbon pricing in the plenary meeting in Berlin. This was almost a nightmare. We are at risk to fail totally to get acceptance for the report. But I would say there is now an increasing awareness among many other countries. And for example, one interesting example is Australia. It relies very heavily on coal. But nevertheless, they understand that carbon pricing allows them to capture the rents from their own coal mines and to use this for other purposes. So this is something which has to be figured out. So the negotiation process is now starting. And so the interesting thing is that there is now a divide within the owners of the fossil fuels. And they should not be perceived as one group. Because on the one hand, you have oil and gas, and on the one hand, you have coal. And the oil and gas people are increasingly prepared to accept a carbon price to get rid of coal. And this is absolutely okay, because the majority of coal has to remain underground. You have much more flexibility for gas and oil. Gas can be combined with renewables. And I think this is an interesting movement, so to say, the split within the fossil fuel industry. Companies like BP, even Exxon, Shell, they would accept a carbon price if the carbon price is announced in advance. If it is credible, so they would accept this. So, and this is an interesting part of the game, and we should use this kind of discourse in our debates.
Dan, and then let me come to Elizabeth after that, and Tony. Okay, so Dan.
So two of the ethical insights that Francis raises in the Encyclical are ecological debt and differentiated responsibilities. And I'm wondering if you see these concepts having a role in carbon pricing, and if so, how that might fit into conversations about pricing carbon.
So both aspects definitely can have a role, and I would like to come back what I said at the very beginning. So we cannot expect that the countries like Vietnam, just an example, will accept a high carbon price without transfers from the Green Climate Fund. And the Green Climate Fund is exactly designed for this purpose, to help the countries to increase the carbon price, and also that they can find a way that somebody will reimburse the costs. And this is a way, I would say, how you can apply this proposition of differentiated, common but differentiated responsibility.
Elizabeth?
Have spoken about
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Sorry, that's it. Yeah.
We've spoken about the atmosphere as a commons that has limits in terms of how much carbon we can, more we can put in than what we already have. A significant percentage of the carbon that we're emitting is being absorbed into the oceans and causing acidification. That is, if it continues, is threatening the collapse of the entire marine ecosystem, because the features that are at the base of that food chain can't calcify in the way that they're supposed to. Is the ocean also a commons? And if we consider that as part of this discussion, as well as the atmosphere as a commons, would that help expedite some kind of action in carbon tax system, both psychically, because we maybe psychically become more aware of the urgency of what we're facing and the consequences of inaction, and also legally, are there any international treaties about, with regard to the oceans, that could help provide a legal framework for expediting action if we thought about the ocean also as part of the global commons?
Yeah, definitely. The ocean are also a global common, and you are absolutely right. So if we increase the carbon budget in the atmosphere, we also are at risk to increase the acidification of the oceans. And this is an important aspect here, and this is the reason why solar radiation management in the end will not work, because it's not just about the global mean temperatures. You might think about technical devices, for example, to inject aerosols into the stratosphere to steer the radiation balance of Earth. So this could, in the best case, I do not think this is in the end a viable technology, but in the best case, you could steer the global mean temperature, but it remains a problem with the acidification of the oceans if we have a too large carbon budget into the atmosphere. So both are interconnected. So basically, to limit the increase of global mean temperature around 2 degrees has also some implication or implies that we want to have an upper limit of the acidification in the ocean. So, and this is probably the most important reason why solar radiation management is in the end not a proper tool to deal with the global mean temperature. So you're absolutely right, but the good news is here, if we are would be successful to limit the increase of the global mean temperature, at the same time we can manage, so to say, to a certain extent, the acidification of the oceans. But you are absolutely right. It's not just the atmosphere. It's about the oceans. It's about some characteristics of land. So we have much more global commons. And because of the climate change problem, so we become more and more aware that we have much more global commons to manage than we thought a few decades ago.
Tony? Yeah.
I would just like to raise the issue of discussion a little on the climate change denialism, which you mentioned briefly, which I've always regarded as a particularly American problem, which comes out of this American libertarian government is evil philosophy. And I had a personal run-in with this at the Vatican almost a year ago, and I helped organize an event at the Political Academy of Sciences when they attempted to hijack us, including your friend Christopher Monkton and his goons from Breitbart and other people like that. The good news is they just made fools of themselves, and the Vatican is well aware of where this problem is coming from, and they're well aware that it's a well-funded American problem. Now, all of us here who work in this area spend way too much time fighting these deniers, and it's just, and to me, and I think this is what they do. They suck your energy out of finding solutions into fighting meaningless battles, and I'm just wondering how we deal with this. What I really wanted to ask you is, you mentioned countries like Poland and Hungary, and I'm wondering, do you see a problem of denialism there? And I'm wondering, is there a distortion of Catholic social teaching in countries like Poland and Hungary? You've mentioned a nationalism, yes, but I'm also wondering, is there an issue of, like, I know, for example, the Acton Institute, which is an American institute funded by the Koch brothers and Exxon, climate deniers. I know they're active in places like Poland. I know people like George Weigel are active in places like Poland, who's also against the science of climate change. So I'm being very blunt here, but I'm just wondering how much of a problem this is in places like Poland, Hungary, and Europe, where I would not regard as a ground zero of climate denialism.
Yeah, this is a very important question. You said the Vatican is very well aware of this. The Vatican is now very well aware of this. When I had my first interactions with the Vatican in 2008, so George Weigel was a very, very powerful and a very, very influential figure in the Vatican. In 2014, I had the privilege to talk 1 hour with Pope Francis about this climate issue. And it was very interesting to see that Pope Francis, from the very beginning on, I thought he will ask me about the science of climate change. So for him, this was not a big issue. So he had a sufficient briefing on this. He was aware of the reports of the IPCC. He was much more interested in this conversation on the ethical dimensions of climate change. But thanks to Pope Francis, it is quite clear that the Vatican has changed his position dramatically. And I would like to highlight, in 2009, I started a project together with a charity organization, Miserio in Germany, together with Munich Re, about climate change and poverty, and we organized 4 conferences in the Vatican, and it is very interesting to see what happened. You had bishops from Europe, parts of Europe, you have bishops in the United States who say, oh, climate science is unsecure, uncertain, we do not know how to deal with that. If you listen to the bishops from Latin America and from the Philippines, they say, for us, climate change is not a scientific theory. For us, it's part of our everyday life. And when Pope Francis became Pope, when Cardinal Bergoglio became Pope, so the exactly same bishops from Latin America approached him and said, we want to have an encyclical on poverty and climate change and the linkages about this. So this is a big change in the Vatican, and you cannot underestimate or overestimate, I don't know. So what happened in the Vatican since Pope Francis now is steering the whole thing. Now about the Eastern Europe, about George Weigel, that's enormously important. And I agree with you. We have to observe very carefully what's going on in Europe, in particular in Hungary and in Poland, because this is basically the same idea. Government is not in the Europe, in this country is inherently bad, but the government should not impose too much regulation on the economy. It's very much nationalistic, and they basically, all of them fundamentally deny any kind of the climate change problem. And the distortion of the social teaching of the Catholic Church, this is enormously important. And what I would like to propose here, we have to make an effort in Europe in these parts, and particularly in the Catholic Church, to start a dialogue exactly about the more profound, fundamental ethical issues. And this is, for me, it's a tragedy. John Paul II, who came from Poland, he was a strong advocate of the social teaching of the Church. He was one of the first in Poland who starts a dialogue about this. This is almost forgotten, even in the Bishop Conference. So I would like to encourage you, and let's start a dialogue. So in particular in Eastern Europe, this is enormously important, and we should not write off this part of the world, because even in the Balkan they are building coal-fired plants, and in Poland they will build coal-fired plants. But the whole thing is not a technical issue. It's a much more profound issue about ethics, about the world views, and promoting in particular in these areas the social teaching of the Church is very, very important.
But even beyond that, isn't there some a little more passive version of this? When you presented in Berlin after the Encyclical was released in a podium discussion with the Archbishop of Freiburg, there was, I feel, a kind of ambivalence sometimes amongst church officials about this as being one of the key parts of Catholic social teaching, and whether the climate change issues, I think some of the U.S. bishops as well were a little bit ambivalent about the acceptance of this. Is that almost more pernicious, the idea that there's not so much the outright deniers who can be dismissed because of the science, but a sort of passive wishing that this would just go away as an issue?
Yeah, but now here I would ask the theologists here. From my point of view, I heard many times the following proposition where bishops said, this is nothing where we priests should care of, right? So this is not our business. It's not our business to talk about minimum wages. It's not our business to talk about carbon taxes. It's not our business to talk even about the ethical dimensions of climate change. And my feeling is many bishops have no idea how to deal with this encyclical. So they are basically overwhelmed and say, okay, so this is a very strange thing. Now let's find a way to circumvent any problems. And this is also a big issue. If a bishop would start in his diocese a dialogue about this issue, even in Germany, you will have very conservative Catholics, climate deniers. They will say, please, you should stop this, because this is a scientific issue, and a scientific debate is not an issue, not a matter for a bishop, and it's even not a matter for the Pope. So, and this is something which is, my feeling is that many bishops and even many priests in the parishes are very reluctant to start and to launch a debate about these issues. And if I think about my own parish in Potsdam, it's for me very easy to anticipate what would happen if the priest would there the parish priest a debate about climate change.
Let's see. I don't know where to go. Dan, and then not behind Tom, there was somebody who's had her hand up for a long time. Not Barb, but in front of her. So, okay. Dan, go ahead.
Thank you for this discussion. Last night you pointed out that in the Encyclical, Francis affirms the principle of the polluter should pay. And you said, look, today we're subsidizing fossil fuels at $150 a ton, and that this needs to stop. And it struck me last night that that's not so much polluter pays as don't pay the polluter. And that if we're going with a polluter pays principle, then we have to calculate kind of the environmental costs, the environmental health and social health, and that needs to be attended to as well. And so I'm wondering how that might fit into carbon pricing, if it does in your opinion, or what do we do with that?
Should we collect a few statements and more people can say, and then I will respond?
Yeah, okay. So the question back here was, you're hitting, yeah.
Yeah, and I apologize.
We're going to collect a couple and then we'll go, yeah.
I was trying to bring it back to another more realistic view. I work for an investment firm. So I'm struggling with the continuing conflict between long-term and short-term. I work for long-term investors, but the market is very short-term in its interaction. And we're measured on a quarterly basis. In politics, we're talking about a 10-year decision period, but it's very possible that we'll have an American president who completely takes us out of Paris agreements, and that's a short-term political decision for them. I understand the economic models, and I understand that the transition period is hard, and some people think in the long term we're all dead, kind of thing. So how do we work with those realistic challenges?
Okay. Let's see, Barb?
Sort of in a related way, I wondered if you would speak to why, I'm assuming you've scuttled hope for the carbon emissions trading scheme, and if you could clarify that distinction between issuing rights to pollute that can be traded versus carbon taxes, which are really not issuing rights to pollute in the same way. It's just a tax. Anyway.
Yeah.
So, and then let's see, how much time do we have, Vince? When are we supposed to? Okay, so let's just take those three, sorry, because then we do have to, okay, we stay a little bit on schedule, so.
Okay, so I like the proposition, don't pay the polluter, that's right. But if we get rid of all the subsidies, so basically for me, get rid of the subsidies and increasing a carbon price is almost the same, right? So a subsidy reform plus a carbon pricing reform, that should be negotiated and designed at once, so to say. And before Paris, I said a carbon price of 0 would be a big success. And this was not an expression of cynicism. It was just to say if we would get rid of the subsidies, this would be a big step, and then a carbon price of 0, then we could start to make the carbon price more positive. So in that sense, it should be negotiated and should be designed in one package. Then short-term and long-term, you're absolutely right. And this is something which we are discussing also, that the short-term and the long-term issue is fundamental. And this is a kind of a commitment problem. So we would get rid of the commitment problem if politicians would be in a situation to announce, for example, an increasing carbon price. So this would do the trick. But the problem is, so the commitment in the political sphere is a big issue. So in that sense, you are absolutely right. We have no way to overcome this short-term and this long-term issues. And therefore, I start to talk about the short-term entry points in climate policy. And carbon pricing, even if the carbon prices are not announced for the next 20 years, so if countries learn that the carbon price does not hurt the economy, they can raise money, they can use the money for useful purposes. So this is something, a kind of a learning process, which hopefully leads to a situation where politicians then in the end might be enabled to make stronger long-term commitments. Now, carbon tax and carbon pricing. So you as an economist know that in theory there is absolutely no difference between carbon pricing and carbon trading. But in reality it is. And it's a fundamental difference. And you can analyze this fundamental difference very nicely in the European emissions trading scheme. And therefore I would like to make one comment here. In 2008 we had a financial crisis. The actual emissions in the European emissions trading scheme were below the upper limit of the emissions. So what happened is this produces an oversupply in the market. Now when there's an oversupply at the market, so the traders at the market start to speculate what the politicians will do. And the politicians announced, oh, some of the oversupply we will take away. In a later stage, we will inject the permits again. What happened is that the investors formed expectations about the politicians, and they priced in all the announcements the politicians made. And what was the result? The result was the price was declining and declining beyond the market fundamentals. So this was the interesting thing. So whenever you have an oversupply in an emissions trading scheme, you are at a bifurcation point. This transforms your emissions trading scheme, because then you have basically a situation where the traders do no longer observe technologies, they observe the announcement of the politicians. This is, from a social science point of view, highly exciting, but it's not exactly what we intended, what was our intention with the design of the emissions trading. Now, what could be the fix? The fix could be a hybrid system. A hybrid system means you have a quantity regulation, but at the same time, the EU Commission, for example, announces a minimum price or a price floor, an increasing price floor, in order to stabilize the expectations of the investors. So this could do the trick, and this is the main difference from my point of view between carbon taxation. In Europe, we cannot impose a carbon tax at the European level. This, from a constitutional point of view, there is no way to do this. The only way to do this is carbon trading, but fortunately, you can always design a carbon trading scheme in a way that it works like a tax. So this is nothing which would be wise to say this in the same words in Brussels, but nevertheless, it's exactly what we want to do. So we want to have a system where the tax and the carbon trading scheme works in a similar way. And this kind of hybrid systems become more and more popular. You have such discussions in California, for example, and in other parts of the world. But it's important because in 2017, China will implement a nationwide emissions trading scheme, and therefore it would be highly important that Europe starts to experiment to test the hybrid system, because I really wish that China will not replicate the same mistakes we made in Europe.
Okay, with that, I think we've come to the end of this session. I'd like to thank Ottmar for his contributions here. And we now have a break for 20 minutes or so before the next session starts, and enjoy some refreshments outside. Anything to announce, Monty? Vince? Okay.